Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about American imperialism
Mm.
using excerpts from the American Yop
All right.
to explore how the U.S.,
Okay.
just a century
Well, a century.
after breaking free from an empire,
Yeah,
started acting like one itself.
that's right.
It's a fascinating story. A
Yeah.
nation founded on the rejection of colonial rule,
Right.
venturing down that very same path. We're
Yeah.
talking the late 19th and early 20th centuries,
Uh-huh.
a period where America really flexed its muscles on the world stage.
It is a fascinating paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's often overlooked that even before the dramatic events of the Spanish-American War,
Okay.
the U.S. was already deeply involved in interventions abroad.
So it wasn't just this sudden burst of imperial ambition.
Not at all.
Okay.
You see this early on with the open door policy in China
Uh-huh.
in 1899.
Okay.
On the surface, it sounds like a policy of fairness.
Right. Promoting equal access to trade for all nations.
Right, like a level playing field for international commerce.
Yeah.
But when we dig a little deeper,
Okay.
we see that it was primarily designed to ensure American businesses
Mm-hmm.
got a sizable chunk of the vast Chinese market.
Hmm.
It was, in many ways, a form of economic coercion,
Okay.
using American influence to pry open doors for its own benefit.
So economic interests driving foreign policy.
Absolutely.
We see that pattern emerging early on.
Absolutely. And sometimes those economic interests took on rather peculiar forms.
Okay, now you got to tell me more. What do you mean?
Well, consider the Guano Islands Act of 1856.
Okay.
It authorized American citizens to take possession of islands containing guano deposits.
Guano. Wait, are we talking about bird droppings here?
Indeed.
Wow.
Guano was a highly prized fertilizer at the time,
Mm.
essential for industrial agriculture.
Oh, okay.
So in essence, the U.S. was claiming these often remote islands for their bird poop.
That's wild. I never would have thought bird droppings could be a catalyst for territorial expansion.
It might seem amusing at first glance.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it actually reveals a lot about the American mindset at the time.
Okay.
This growing desire for expansion, for resources, and the willingness to go to great lengths to secure them.
Okay.
The Guano Islands Act may have been about fertilizer,
Yeah.
but it set a precedent for claiming far-flung territories, a precedent that would have significant consequences later on.
Wow. It's amazing how seemingly insignificant things can have such ripple effects.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And speaking of unexpected players in this story of expanding American influence,
Okay.
we can't overlook the role of American missionaries.
Right. It wasn't just about military power and economic interests.
That's right.
There was this whole other dimension of cultural and religious influence at play.
Exactly. And it wasn't always a clear-cut division between these spheres of influence.
Okay.
Take Hawaii, for example.
Okay.
American missionaries went there with the intention of spreading the gospel,
Uh-huh.
but ended up deeply intertwined with the island's economic and political landscape.
So it wasn't just about converting people to Christianity.
Not entirely.
Okay.
These missionaries established schools, hospitals, and crucially lucrative sugar plantations.
Hmm.
They amassed considerable wealth and influence,
Wow.
becoming powerful figures in Hawaiian society.
Okay.
This entanglement of religious and economic motivations
Mm-hmm.
would eventually contribute to the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy
Wow.
and the annexation of the islands by the U.S. in 1898.
So these missionaries, in a way, paved the way for American imperialism in Hawaii. It's a much more complicated story than just spreading the word of God.
Much more complicated.
Yeah.
And then you have the Mexican Revolution,
Okay.
which erupted in 1910 and raged for a decade.
Wow.
It was a chaotic and bloody affair.
Mm-hmm.
And the U.S. once again found itself drawn into the conflict,
Okay.
seeking to protect its economic interests and exert its influence over events.
Mexico, being right on America's doorstep, must have made it very difficult to stay out of it.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And there were a number of flashpoints that highlighted just how volatile the situation was.
Okay.
The Tampico incident in 1914,
Uh-huh.
where American sailors were briefly detained by Mexican forces,
Mm.
and the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in 1916,
Yeah.
after his raid on Columbus, New Mexico,
Okay.
are prime examples of how quickly things could escalate.
So even though the U.S. wasn't officially at war with Mexico,
Right?
it was deeply involved in trying to shape the outcome of the revolution.
Exactly.
Wow.
And these interventions, while often framed as responses to specific provocations,
Uh-huh.
were part of a broader pattern of the U.S. asserting itself as the dominant power in the region,
Okay.
a pattern that would continue throughout the 20th century.
It's fascinating to see how these early interventions,
Yeah.
from claiming islands for their bird droppings
Right?
to meddling in the Mexican Revolution,
Uh,
set the stage for America's emergence as a global power.
Yeah.
But there's another area I'd love to explore: American involvement in the Middle East before World War I.
yes. A lesser-known aspect of this period, but an important one nonetheless.
Okay.
While Europe was busy carving up the Ottoman Empire,
Okay.
American involvement in the Middle East was largely driven by, you guessed it, missionaries.
Okay. So missionaries are popping up everywhere in this story.
They were incredibly active during this era.
Yeah.
And in the Middle East, they focused on establishing schools, hospitals, and universities,
Yeah.
institutions that would have a lasting impact on the region.
So it wasn't about military bases or securing oil fields at that point.
Not yet.
Okay.
This was about building influence through cultural and educational institutions,
Uh-huh.
laying the groundwork for future American involvement in the region.
Okay.
However, all of these interventions, all of
Yeah.
these threads of influence,
Uh-huh.
pale in comparison to the seismic shift that occurred in 1898,
Okay.
the Spanish-American War.
The year everything changed for America's role on the world stage.
Yeah,
Wow.
and it all began with Cuba's struggle for independence from Spain.
Uh-huh.
Newspapers back in the U.S. were churning out sensationalized stories
Wow.
about Spanish atrocities, whipping up public opinion into a frenzy.
So a media-driven war, much like we see today.
In many ways, yes.
Mm.
The press played a significant role in shaping public perception
Mm-hmm.
and pushing the U.S. towards war.
Yeah.
And then there was the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898.
The incident that became the catalyst for war, right?
Precisely.
Wow.
The sinking of the Maine,
Yeah.
likely caused by an accidental internal explosion,
Oh, wow.
was blamed on Spain,
Uh-huh.
further inflaming public opinion and pushing the U.S. to the brink of war.
And then just a few months later,
That's right.
the U.S. declares war on Spain.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that the war itself was relatively short and decisive.
Yeah.
John Hay, the U.S. Secretary of State at the time,
Uh.
famously called it a splendid little war.
A rather flippant remark, considering the consequences that followed.
Okay.
Yes, fewer than 400 Americans died in battle during the Spanish-American War itself.
Mm.
But the war also resulted in the U.S. acquiring Guam, Puerto Rico,
Wow.
and the Philippines.
Okay.
And it's in the Philippines that things take a much darker turn.
The Philippine-American War,
Exactly.
a conflict that's often overshadowed by the Spanish-American War, but was far more brutal and far more consequential for both countries.
Absolutely. This is where the story of American imperialism gets really complicated.
Yeah.
Here you have a nation founded on the ideals of liberty and self-determination,
Uh-huh.
engaging in a bloody war to suppress a movement for independence in a far-off land.
It's the ultimate irony, isn't it?
It is.
And it ignited a fierce debate within the U.S.
It did.
about the nature of empire, about whether this was a path America should be taking.
And at the heart of that debate was a fundamental question.
Okay.
Could a nation born out of rebellion against colonial rule justify becoming a colonizer itself?
Wow.
This is where we see the rise of the anti-imperialist movement.
Uh-huh.
Figures like Mark Twain,
Yeah.
Andrew Carnegie, and Jane Addams speaking out forcefully
Yeah.
against what they saw as a betrayal of American principles.
It's a reminder that even as America was flexing its muscles on the world stage,
Yes.
there were powerful voices challenging the very notion of American empire.
And those voices would continue to resonate throughout the 20th century and beyond.
Wow.
But for now,
Okay.
let's focus on the immediate aftermath of the Spanish-American War,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the annexation of Hawaii.
Hawaii, a place that conjures up images of paradise, of aloha spirit.
Right.
It's hard to imagine such a place being caught up in the machinations of empire.
And yet that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
While the Philippines were more of an afterthought in the Spanish-American War,
Uh-huh.
the annexation of Hawaii was a calculated move,
Mm.
driven by American businessmen who had already established significant economic and political control over the islands.
So it wasn't a sudden impulse, but a long-term strategy that culminated in annexation.
Precisely.
Right.
These businessmen had already overthrown the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893,
Wow.
establishing a provisional government with the aim of eventually joining the U.S.
Wow.
The Spanish-American War simply provided the opportunity to formally annex the islands.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it?
It is.
The U.S. taking over a land that's synonymous with peace and hospitality.
The irony is certainly striking,
Yeah.
and it underscores the complex and often contradictory nature of American imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
But to understand the true depths of that contradiction,
Okay.
we need to turn our attention to the Philippines,
Okay.
a nation that would become America's most troublesome and tragic colonial venture.
A nation that, as you mentioned earlier, found itself fighting alongside the U.S. against Spain,
That's right.
only to end up under American occupation.
Exactly.
That's got to be a bitter pill to swallow.
Indeed, and that sense of betrayal would fuel a bloody and protracted conflict that would challenge America's self-image and expose the dark underbelly of its imperial ambition.
The Philippine-American War.
Yes,
A conflict that would force America to confront the true costs of empire.
it would.
A conflict that would leave lasting scars on both nations.
It would.
But that's a story for part 2 of our deep dive.
Right?
We left off talking about the Philippines and how they ended up under American control after fighting alongside the U.S. against Spain.
Talk about a complicated situation.
Mm,
Yeah, it's almost as if the victory celebration was cut short by this whole new conflict.
The Philippine-American War, right. It seems like this conflict doesn't get as much attention as the Spanish-American War, even though it was far more brutal.
That's right. The fighting was intense. A lot of guerrilla warfare taking place in difficult terrain.
Hmm.
It wasn't the splendid little war that John Hay had described.
Right, it makes you wonder if those in power truly understood what they were getting into.
Yeah, the casualty figures tell a very different story. Thousands of American soldiers died in this conflict, and countless Filipinos lost their lives as well. It was a long and bloody war that lasted for years.
I can only imagine the American public must have had really mixed feelings about all of this.
Oh, absolutely. There were
Okay.
definitely mixed feelings. On the one hand, you had those who, believed in America's duty to civilize the Philippines,
Okay.
to bring them progress and democracy.
Right.
But on the other hand, you had growing opposition to the war, with people questioning the morality and the cost of this imperial venture.
So this idea of a civilizing mission was used to justify the war.
Yes, and it was a powerful argument for some. They believed that the U.S. had a responsibility to uplift the Filipinos to teach them the ways of democracy and modern society. But for others, this rhetoric rang hollow. They saw it as a thinly veiled attempt to mask the true motives of empire, which were economic exploitation and strategic dominance.
It seems like every empire uses similar justifications, bringing civilization, spreading progress, but often at a great cost to the people they claim to be helping.
Exactly, and the Philippine-American War is a stark example of that the U.S. military employed brutal tactics in an attempt to pacify the islands, tactics that would be condemned as atrocities today. There were reports of torture massacres, the widespread destruction of villages.
Yeah, it sounds like this conflict really brought to light the dark side of American imperialism.
Absolutely, and it created a deep moral dilemma for many Americans, especially those fighting in the war. Imagine being a soldier told you're fighting for freedom and democracy, only to find yourself engaged in a brutal counterinsurgency campaign against people who are simply trying to defend their homeland.
That must have been incredibly disillusioning.
It was a profound moral crisis for many, and it fueled the growing anti-imperialist movement. Back home, you had prominent figures like Mark Twain, who initially supported the war, becoming outspoken critics of American actions in the Philippines. He even wrote a scathing satire called To the Person Sitting in Darkness that ridiculed the idea of a civilizing mission.
So even those who initially bought into the idea of empire started to have second thoughts.
Yeah, the realities of the war, the brutality, the moral ambiguity, all of it chipped away at the justifications for empire, and it made people question whether this was the path America should be taking.
So in the midst of all this fighting and all this questioning, the U.S. government still had to figure out what to do with the Philippines.
Yes, they couldn't just keep fighting indefinitely, so they sent commissions to the Philippines to assess the situation and recommend a course of action. These commissions were made up of politicians, academics, and military officials, and their task was to essentially figure out how to rule this new territory.
It's fascinating to think about these commissions going over there, trying to make sense of a completely different culture and society.
It must have been a daunting task. They had to navigate complex political and social dynamics, deal with ongoing resistance to American rule, and try to establish some semblance of order.
And what did they ultimately recommend?
Well, they eventually recommended the establishment of a civilian administration to govern the Philippines. This led to the appointment of William Howard Taft, who later became President of the United States as the first Governor General of the Philippines.
So from fighting a war to setting up a government, it sounds like the U.S. was trying to transition from a military occupation to a more long-term colonial administration.
Exactly. The goal was to establish a system of governance that would be more palatable to the Filipinos while still maintaining American control. They implemented reforms, built infrastructure, and tried to foster economic development.
But even with these efforts, there was still resistance to American rule, right?
Absolutely. The war may have officially ended in 1902 when Teddy Roosevelt declared victory, but resistance continued in various forms for years. There were still armed uprisings, and there was also growing political opposition to American colonialism.
So it wasn't just about military pacification. The U.S. had to contend with a complex web of political and social forces.
Precisely, and this gets to the heart of the challenge of empire. It's one thing to conquer a territory, but it's quite another to effectively govern it, especially when you're facing a population that resents your presence.
And this resentment wasn't just limited to the Philippines, was it? Back in the U.S., the debate over imperialism was still raging on.
That's right, the Philippine-American War had deeply divided American society. You had the Anti-Imperialist League, which was gaining momentum with members like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie denouncing the war and advocating for Philippine independence.
So it wasn't just a fringe movement. There was real opposition to empire within the U.S. itself.
Absolutely. The anti-imperialists argued that colonialism was a betrayal of America's founding principles, that it went against everything the nation stood for. They also raised concerns about the costs of empire, both in terms of human life and financial resources.
It seems like they were raising some fundamental questions about America's identity and its role in the world.
They were indeed, and those questions were further complicated by the issue of immigration. The U.S. was already experiencing a massive influx of immigrants from Europe, and now it had to grapple with the question of how to incorporate millions of Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, and Guamanians into the American fabric.
It sounds like a recipe for anxiety and social upheaval.
It certainly was, and it fueled a wave of nativism and xenophobia. There were fears that these new immigrants, particularly those who weren't white or Protestant, would threaten American values and undermine American identity.
So we see this link between imperialism and immigration, with both forces shaping the anxieties and prejudices of the time.
Precisely. And it's in this context that we see the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the first law to ban immigration based on race. It's a stark reminder of the discriminatory attitudes that were prevalent during this era.
And it wasn't just about race. There were also religious tensions at play. The clash between Catholicism and American Protestantism played a significant role in shaping public discourse and influencing policy decisions.
Yes, there was this fear that Catholics, with their allegiance to the Pope, couldn't be truly loyal American citizens. This fear fueled prejudice and discrimination against Catholic immigrants, and it even led to debates within the Catholic Church itself about how to navigate the challenges of assimilation.
So we're seeing how these different strands of American imperialism, the military interventions, the economic expansion, the cultural influence were all intertwined with these anxieties about race, religion, and national identity.
Exactly. And this complex interplay of forces would continue to shape American society and America's role in the world throughout the 20th century.
And that's where we'll pick up in part. Part 3 of our deep dive will explore how these themes of empire, immigration, and identity continue to resonate in the modern era. We've been talking about, the rise of American imperialism from those early interventions, like the Guano Islands Act, to the tumultuous period of the Spanish-American and Philippine-American Wars. And it's become clear that this outward expansion wasn't just about military might or economic interests. It was deeply intertwined with anxieties about immigration, race, and what it meant to be American back home.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so as we move deeper into the 20th century, these themes continue to play out in fascinating and sometimes troubling ways. So think about the Progressive Era, for example, a period of immense social and political reform.
Right, a lot of efforts to address poverty.
Right, improve working conditions, clean up corrupt city governments.
Exactly.
Seems like a very idealistic time.
It was in many ways.
But beneath that idealism, you also see this impulse to control, to regulate, to impose order on a society that seemed to be changing too rapidly.
Yeah, there's definitely a connection there.
So you're saying there's a connection between the desire to control things abroad through imperialism and the urge to manage things at home through these progressive reforms.
Precisely the same anxieties that fueled imperial expansion also fueled these efforts to shape and mold American society. Take, for example, the obsession with scientific management. The idea that you could apply engineering engineering principles to make society run more efficiently.
Uh-huh.
It's not a huge leap from that mindset to the belief that you could also engineer other nations,
Okay.
other cultures, to conform to American ideals.
So even though there was pushback against overt imperialism,
Yeah.
those underlying ideas about America's role in shaping the world persisted?
They did, and they found new outlets in the 20th century, not just through military interventions, but through economic and cultural influence.
Like dollar diplomacy,
Exactly.
which we touched on earlier.
Right.
It's a subtler form of empire,
Mm-hmm.
using financial leverage to exert control.
Exactly. Instead of sending in troops, you send in bankers and investors.
Right.
And alongside that, you have the rise of mass media, Hollywood movies, American consumer goods spreading around the globe.
Uh-huh.
This cultural imperialism, in many ways, proved even more potent than military might.
Yeah, it's like those Heinz demonstrators we talked about,
Right.
but on a massive scale.
Exactly.
American culture becomes the product being sold worldwide.
Exactly. But as American influence expanded,
Okay.
so too did the resentment and pushback against it.
Okay.
You see this in the rise of anti-colonial movements around the world,
Uh-huh.
in the growing resistance to American economic and cultural dominance.
So it's not a simple story of America imposing its will on the world.
It's not
There's always resistance,
always.
a counter-narrative pushing back.
And that tension, that interplay between American power and the forces resisting it,
Mhm.
shapes much of the 20th century and continues to this day.
Wow.
Think about the Cold War,
Yeah.
the Vietnam War,
Yeah.
the War on Terror.
All of these conflicts in different ways reflect that struggle for global influence.
Right.
And the pushback against it.
Exactly.
So we're seeing these long historical arcs,
We are.
these themes that stretch across decades, even centuries.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the question we posed at the beginning.
Yeah.
Did the U.S. in those early decades of the 20th century
Yeah.
truly become an empire?
Right.
And if so, what kind of empire was it?
Yeah, what stands out to you in all of this?
What strikes me is how the U.S. grappled with the very idea of empire,
Okay.
the contradictions it exposed in America's self-image.
On the one hand, this nation born out of rebellion against an empire.
Right.
On the other hand, this impulse to exert control, to shape the world in its own image.
Yeah, precisely. And that tension, that internal struggle, continues to define America's relationship with the world.
Mm.
It's a story of ambition and idealism of power, and its consequences, a story that's still being written today.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into American imperialism. You've heard the stories, explored the complexities, and now it's your turn to grapple with the legacies of this pivotal period. If the 20th century was in many ways defined by the projection of American power across the globe, what might the 21st century hold? Will we see a retreat from global engagement, or will America find new ways to assert its influence in a rapidly changing world? These are the questions we leave you with, dear listener, to ponder and explore. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.